course, hears that.
Hi, Cynthia. A pleasure to have you today as part of this ReachX with Me series.
Hello, how are you? Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I'm doing great. Thank you. So thank you for joining us today. And so just for our audience as well, to kind of like give a quick update as well, and for those of you who don't know, ReachX. ReachX is a FCA regulated platform offering private markets deal origination and investment consulting, CFO services, and CFO services and interim services as well, and throughout the network for like 2,000 and 500 consultants. So basically, ReachX helps the client source the deals, research, and do the due diligence, investment opportunities, and source as well specialized interim C-level talent for long-term projects. And today we're welcoming Cynthia, who is and you're joining us, Cynthia, to speak about ESGs, and we're really excited to have you today as part of this new ReachX with Me series. So we want to, first of all, for our audience and people who don't know you, maybe Cynthia, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit who you are and what you have been doing so far?
Let me just first start by saying hello and thank you everybody for inviting me to share my thoughts on ESG. I want to be very clear that what I'm going to say over the next 20 minutes is very much my ideas and thoughts and experience. It's not gospel, and I'm not going to give you any easy answers. So that's sort of the first thing I want to say. ESG is becoming a very, very complicated industry, and it really does require experts in the field. But I have worked for a number of companies, which I suppose qualifies me to be up here and speak to you at least on an informal podcast. I've been involved in ESG for a number of years as Director of Investor Relations, where ESG naturally sat several years ago. Most recently, I've worked for Workspace Group, which is a property REIT. I worked for Care Group, which is in construction and infrastructure, and AO World, which is an online retailer. So very, very different companies, very different industries. I'm also a board director and chair of the audit committee for Orwell Housing, which is a builder of affordable housing and provider of social care services. So again, quite a wide range of industries I've worked in, and all of them are approaching ESG from quite a different point of view. Construction, for example, has one of the highest carbon footprints, but they have a lot of control over the methods of construction that they employ, the materials they use, particularly in things like concrete, which has a very high carbon footprint, and how they utilize a circular economy. So most of their challenges in ESG fall in scope 1. Online retailers like AO World, most of their ESG emissions fall into scope 3, which is end product use. So what their customers are actually using. Are they selling enough efficient products? The automotive industry is another example, facing penalties for not selling enough electrical vehicles. And that's my experience.
Amazing. It's super rich experience, and wanted to really mention something about the ESG strategies, because we hear a lot of stuff being said about ESG strategies, and every company, really every industry seems to have almost like at some point their own as well orientation and thoughts about that. How do you define an ESG company usually for when you want to work and implement that kind of initiative within a company?
ESG was always defined as environment, social, and governance. Governance has been pushed the hardest. It was the easiest to accomplish. It was regulation, how you ran your companies. That was easy. Social was always a bit of a soft target. What did you do for the community? What good did you do, etc. And then environmental was always the hardest one, which is the one the government is pushing the most. Social has evolved from being happy in the community to actually looking at very painful issues like diversity, inclusion and equality, gender pay gaps, diversity on boards, particularly in gender and ethnicity. And so social is rising up the scale in terms of what is challenging to implement. Climate change is now subject to huge amount of regulation. Supranational organizations, our own UK government, other countries have all implemented very strict targets for climate change that need to be reached by 2050. So that is actually In some ways more challenging because it is painful to implement. It has to be implemented and integrated into your strategic planning. But in other ways, you do have a regulatory framework. So in some ways, that's a little bit easier.
Okay, and it's in terms of like the ESG strategies, from some kind of like maybe some examples of successful initiatives that you've seen recently. Do you have anyone in mind anyone that comes to mind?
Everybody's moving along at different speeds. I hate to point out this is a good company and a bad company. There's sort of a spectrum of where companies are, and it's been a convention to divide them into 5 stages, from the ones that are the most need to do the most work to those who are actually quite far advanced. So the very first stage is sort of the reactive stage, where you're just reacting to inquiries that come in. It's very siloed. It's a very traditional approach to ESG. You get a request in from somebody and you send the questionnaire back out again. Managed is sort of the next phase over, that companies are recognizing it's more than just being ad hoc reactive responses. So the material issues on the ESG scale are being identified and managed, but it is being driven by internal audit and the view on the risk to the company. Most companies at the moment are sort of in the middle phase, which is called optimized phase. So material issues have been identified and approached as sources of operating efficiency. And that's what's driving ESG, is operating efficiency and investment opportunities, but it's still not fully integrated. And that's because integrating it into day-to-day business operations is quite challenging. Integrated is where sustainability is fully integrated into basic business planning. So it's discussed in the forward planning, the budgeting of the future, what's going to be needed, what are the risks, etc. And that's where most companies like August, for example, is in that category, quite a number of others. And then the holy grail is probably purposeful, which is driving sustainability is actually the reason for the company. Whereas 30 years ago, Milton Friedman's theory of profits for shareholders trickling down through society, and that was the reason of a company existed, was to generate profits. It is now sustainability. Unilever and IKEA would be examples of those people who have actually replaced their corporate vision with sustainability.
Okay, that's super cool and super insightful. Thank you very much for sharing this with us, Cynthia. And on the trends, ESG has been, probably widely spread, and also especially initiatives for many years now. But there were different phases, and there's an evolution clearly. In the past years, we've seen a big shift as well, and really kind of almost an acceleration in terms of like the implementation of initiatives. So I guess my question to you is, what has changed really in this past 2 years, and what do you see and what do you think is going to be are going to be the trends in the next future?
There's a number of let me just go back. I'm sorry, I'm just a bit of broad day today, so I wrote down some thoughts, etc., of things to talk about. And some of the reasons what is driving ESG, I suppose, is what you're asking. I mean, the basic one is regulation, and that's what we all have to comply with, etc. So that's easy enough. But there's a number of other ones that are not as obvious. Investors obviously are being leaned on very hard by the UK government as being the custodians of pension funds. So they are being driven to develop ESG screens, draw up a list of companies, industries in which they will not invest. And that's becoming increasingly obvious that you don't want to be on the wrong side of that ESG screen. The two other driving forces, which is perhaps less obvious, is the rise of passive investing. 40% of funds are now passive investors. Passive investors have no way of influencing the performance of a company except through corporate governance, climate change, ESG, and good governance. So they are becoming very involved in ESG, looking at climate change. Are companies complying with regulation? Where are they on that journey? And that's becoming increasingly important. And the other one, which is even less obvious, is activists. It used to be activists would focus on underperforming companies, which is now, with all the macro shocks that we've had over the past 3 or 4 or 5 years, is harder to attack a company on underperforming because there's always a reason why. So instead, oddly enough, ESG is now the leading chink that activists attack, which is interesting. I never would have thought that.
It's very interesting. And do you think that there will be an industry that's going to be more impacted probably by the latest ESG initiatives more than the other ones? And where do you see right now the changes in the industry? I mean, you've mentioned some examples earlier about IKEA, about like some other big brands as well and big names. Do you see some specific industries that are accelerating and some other ones that are a bit late?
It's the ones that generally have faced the biggest challenges. So oil and gas companies are actually got their act together and they're doing quite well. They also happen to be the biggest. I think the challenge is not so much by industry, it's by company size. And to give you an idea, sorry,
Nice.
I'm in a board director for Orwell Housing. We have a fairly old stock of housing. Most of it is 1950s and earlier, so some of it's turn of the century. To actually meet climate change and efficient housing regulations on that, we are going to have to invest about 30,000 per house, and we have almost 7,000 properties.
Okay, yeah, that's like a lot.
So I think it's not so much for a smaller company like Orwell. That's a
Yeah.
huge capital investment.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty big. And maybe one last question for you, Cynthia, in terms of like um, a little bit the frameworks and the different initiatives. And I know you're going to tell me that there's no one size fits it all and no one strategy fits it all in terms of the industries. But at least do you see some kind of trends, especially for companies who are early on in their ESG transformation journey? When they think about when they've made it okay a priority, you mentioned some companies even replacing corporate strategy by a sustainable strategy. Do you see some kind of like anchor or starting point, or at least the beginning of a framework, some kind of like skeleton that almost and some pattern that every company really follows when they want to implement an ESG strategy?
The first thing I would say is that it has to come from the top. It is not an easy thing to implement ESG, and if it is not actually backed by the executive team and the board, it's just too hard to do, and you just won't do it. So I think that's the first thing: is get some cheerleaders on the senior leadership team and build on that and go forward. The second thing, I come back to my first point, is if you're starting this journey, hire an expert. Truly, it may cost you some money, but it'll save you so much pain in the long term, because they will help you define what do you want to measure, what are the KPIs you want to report against for the next 10 years. And the third thing is, before you even start measuring. I've got a lovely story. The company will remain totally nameless, but they were very proud that they'd electrified their entire delivery fleet, which was quite an investment and quite an accomplishment. Unfortunately, nobody bothered to measure the performance of the diesel fleet before they replaced it. So therefore, they had no benchmark. So if you're reporting against the benchmark, it doesn't look very good because you have no improvements because you're already electrified. It's things like that. You really have to think before somebody goes off on a tangent. And that's the key thing. Hire an expert who's going to help you think and give you a context.
And are there databases, a quick bonus question for you, Cynthia, are there databases to benchmark yourself when it comes to, because I saw against competitors and against peers in the industry, because I saw that there's right now an uprise of like and huge boom of solutions that are ESG, SaaS, ESG, solutions that you can use, etc. Do they have that kind of factor of benchmarking? Because I would understand that if someone is starting an initiative and if they are hiring an expert, fine, that expert should know. If they are not, and if they're in kind of early journey and they want to put up like just some kind of objectives on paper, etc., to kind of know what's the goal, etc., they'll probably need some benchmark. Are there some companies doing and providing these kind of benchmarks?
There are, and unfortunately, in any sort of growing industry, there's a number of people purporting to be ESG specialists who aren't. You're just a bit like me, have some experience, but I would never put myself forward as an expert in ESG. I just happen to know a lot about it, but I wouldn't want to advise people on what to do. The best thing if you want a starting point, is to look at your peer group. Look at some companies who are doing it well. So look at IKEA, look at Unilever. What are they reporting? What are they saying? What is the narrative? What's the story around it? Because ESG and its journey is not just numbers. It's a philosophy. It's a corporate vision and a value system. And you need both. You need the numbers, but you also need the soft side. You need the values and the vision. So just look at other examples before you go off. That'll give you a lot of information and places to start.
Yeah, but are there like kind of any because I don't know if when usually a company like implement this kind of strategy, and even if they are in the beginning, for example, if it's an industry where the implementation was not widely spread, maybe they don't actually share the benchmark. Are there like companies providing this kind of tools that people can use and rely on?
There's lots of companies who will help you define your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which is a starting point. And then you can do a timeline of, this is where I need to be. What are we going to do along the way? And there's a lot of software packages will help you do that.
Yeah.
The problem is until you actually get to the point where you're actually focused and you know what you're trying to measure and you know what baby steps you want to take. If you take all of ESG and try to do it at once, I swear you'll have a nervous breakdown. So what areas can you get some quick wins that will encourage people to say, look, this is not as hard as you think it is. And that's where the software comes in handy. So focus on a little area, make some success in that, and then start building on that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Cynthia. Super insightful chat with you, and big thank you. I know that your advices and your insights on ESGs are really enjoyed within the community and within the ReachX platform. So a big thank you for joining us today and tonight. And looking forward to speaking to you soon again.
Absolutely. Really enjoyable. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Take care. Speak to you.